Great. It didn't do the like this meeting is being recorded thing, but I think it is recording. I did it. Yeah, no worries. Um, yeah, that's useful. And I think that's I agree with that. I think it's also like, and as we'll get into it, it's less about a concrete strategy and more about orientations toward concrete strategies, i.e., what you think of concrete strategies or what you think of politics. So I think there are 5 areas of disagreement between sort of a Marxist materialist take on modern politics and what most identity politics would say. So the first one is, I think, just like a disagreement of the conception of identity. So can anyone tell me what Marxist materialism is, or what like historical materialism is?
Like, I'm pretty sure it's like that the way historical values of capitalism as Marx outlines them like appear in our culture.
Yeah, and the most important part of it is that it says that history and society is not a result of like some ideal or some like concept. It's a result of material conditions, right? That's what like dialectic materialism, historical materialism is. So Marxist materialists take a very material view of identity. And this is not just to say like, oh, we're being concrete about it. It's literally just like identity is conceptualized in terms of material events and phenomena, right? Like what it means to be Black is not like some sort of like sort of like external concept or identity. It's a result of a bunch of sociological, like literal like things that happen to you, and a bunch of material events. This disagrees with a lot of ways I think like identity politics affirmatives might frame their agency, which is that they might frame it ontologically, which is that they might conceptualize identity as something that is external and something that is divorced from the material world, and then something that imposes itself onto the material world rather than everything being constructed from the effects of the material world onto it, right? So there is this like thing that sort of like influences the way material politics functions, as opposed to material politics being the only thing that matters in the sense of like how we define identity. So can someone give me an example of an identity politics strategy that might ontologically define a category of identity?
Afro-pessimism?
Yeah, I think Afro-pessimism, I like definitely sort of defines Blackness ontologically, right? It says that there is this like external definition of Blackness. It is non-human. It is whatever the opposite of civil society is, right? It is outside civil society, sort of structurally. And Marxists disagree with that structural understanding of identity, right? So Marxists wouldn't disagree that like being Black is like a huge sort of vector of violence in like modern civil society. They wouldn't disagree with a lot of the material like manifestations of what one might call anti-Blackness, but they disagree that the frame is ontological, right? They just think it's the result of a bunch of material sort of like events, right? Like literal phenomena that sort of like coalesce into violence, as opposed to like a notion of racial ontology. Because what, and the reason, and I think the impact to this that's very important, is that Marxists think that racial ontology is a tool of capitalism because it frames race as something that is an inevitable part of the psyche or an inevitable part of existence, as opposed to something that is within the realm or scope of politics, right? So Marxists think that race can be affected materially, which is why I think it's worth struggling to like, you know, create political change. So examples of this include the election of Chokwe Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi, Malcolm X's like sort of grassroots movements to get that done, Black communism in Alabama. All of this stuff sort of proves that communists and Marxists think that there is this like fundamental impetus to change race and change the way our political structures sort of materially create manifestations of racism. But they think that if you frame race as something that's sort of like out there, that it's just like a natural fact of the world, or that it's some sort of like ontological status, it makes it it makes it an inevitable product of the psyche and not a product of capital, not a product of the material manifestations of power, and not a product of the political structures that you can sort of change, right? So that's why Marxists sort of disagree with the conception of ontology, because they think it leads you to like bad conclusions about how you should orient yourself. Does that make sense?
So it critiques the Av's belief that issues come from the psyche, and it kind of like stifles the ability to make change.
Yeah, and it's a critique of the like sort of consequence of using that metaphor or using that idea, right? Like the consequence of like saying that blackness is an inevitable part of the psyche, or like sorry, anti-blackness is an inevitable part of the psyche, is something that's fundamentally depoliticizing, right? And so that's why Marxists critique this conception of identity. And I want to really emphasize here, like the vast majority of the stuff that like anti-blackness affirmatives highlight, like Marxists have like no disagreement with. They just like disagree with a ontological like sort of blanket imposition of identity, because they believe that it ignores the like really nuanced political ways that like those identities get manifested. Similarly, like the other reason I think they disagree with this is because it sort of ignores the role in capital and politics of shaping that identity, right? Like the ways like identity can change based on how you politically orient it. So for example, you know the classic like right-wing like idiot like talking point about like, oh, the Irish were enslaved too. Like, is everyone familiar with that stuff?
Yeah.
Great. So that's dumb. It makes no sense. It's never made any sense. But the real problem is that it's like a pretty good example of like how politics intersects race. So for example, the Irish were also outside the category of whiteness for a long time, right? Like there was this conception of like who is white, and that was like, you know, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in America. And like, you know, Irish people were outside of that, Black people were outside of that. As time moved on, Irish people became slowly integrated into like the realm of the human or the realms of whiteness, while Black people were sort of pushed out of it. So what happened was like I think at one point in history, like Irish people had their own version of the Dred Scott case, where like some Irish woman was like brutally attacked and murdered by some white people, and the court ruled that like it wasn't a crime because she wasn't human or something like that. So like this was way before like Blackness ever became like codified as a structure in America, so like really early in the beginnings of America. But like the whole point is that like at that moment in time, like being Irish was ontologically outside of whiteness, but the like real point of that example is just to show that like it's a transformable identity, right? Like it's malleable, and it's malleable based on the organization of political institutions, which is why it's worth agitating those institutions to change things. Does that make sense to anyone? Does anyone have any questions about that? Yeah, that's the point, right? Which is this, that like the trap of like immature politics is to frame it as ontological, when in reality the ontological manifestations of Blackness are all the results of political decisions, which can be changed by creating a new politics, by struggling for a better politics. And to be clear, not changed by like, you know, American liberal politics, like, oh, we're gonna elect Obama, like, oh look, Pelosi's wearing kente cloth, like changed by like a literal communist revolution. So their argument is not like, oh, we need reform to change Blackness in America. Their argument is that we need to overthrow American politics. But like when you hear the word politics, like don't limit yourself to just thinking about like oh, who am I going to vote for? Am I going to vote Democrat or Republican? Like you should think of politics as like Malcolm X. You should think of politics as like the Combahee River Collective. You should think of politics as like the Communist Party, like CPUSA. You should think of politics as the NAACP. You should think of politics as the Black Panthers, right? Like that's politics to a Marxist. So when like I was saying that politics has the potential to change the conditions of anti-Blackness within America because they're the result of political institutions. I did not mean in like a baby liberal sense. I meant in like a really radical revolution sense. Does that make sense to everyone?
Could I just like recap what happened just to make sure that I understood it correctly? So like historical materialism says that history and society results in like the concepts and ideals that we have. So as opposed to like identity teams who think that identity is constructed ontologically by the outside, Marxists would think that we should be able to fight for material change because like after the revolution, it can solve for this kind of issue. And then so it's worth struggling to create political change because otherwise, like when we call things ontological, capitalism tells us that like you should stop struggling because it's not going to get better.
Yeah, and that ontological identity is incorrectly framed ontologically because rather it's like manifested materially. Yeah, I agree with all of that. That was a great explanation of this. Great, so that's like a sort of the disagreement on the conception of identity. Now there's a broader disagreement about politics and political orientation. So this is just like the classic, like the position is either explicitly like don't do politics and don't change the state, like in which the link becomes really easy, which is just like this is the only way you can ever affect like a wide number of people. Like you can change individual hearts and minds all you want to, or you can like cope all you want to, but like the real issue is that we have a political system that is far reaching and far and like the only way to ever change, like the only like thing you can do is attempt to change it, because like how else are you going to affect the number of people? Like, you know, like a third of the world's people live in wage slavery, like hundreds of millions of children die from hunger every year. Like we live in a fundamentally unjust world because of the allocation of capital. Only politics has the potential to like, you know, have the level of institutions necessary to change any of that. So being anti-institution or being anti-state or being anti-politics is immature because it precludes the possibility of using those things to benefit the world for the good, precludes the possibility of Marxist government, precludes the possibility of a progressive orientation for like social change. So that's like real simple if the AF is like state is bad. The trickier question is what to do when the AF is like, we don't think, like, we don't, like, we're not pessimistic about the state. We're just like, we get to refuse it. Like it's about us in the room, like sort of like that type of stuff. And the question is, how do you make a link argument when the AF does that type of thing? I think the problem with that is that broadly and sort of like in terms of its logical extension, it's still a pessimistic refusal of political action. And the reason for this is simple, is just because like it says that there are like prerequisites to doing politics, right? It's like my thing, like my AF is a prerequisite to engaging in political action, or because of like my criticism of politics, like, I don't know, sexism, like engaging in politics is a futile idea, like that type of stuff. I think you can sort of criticize the deployment of those metaphors and say refusal is not the same thing. Refusal of politics basically leads to like individual refusal of politics leads to a broad refusal of politics. And the reason that's like great is because we as agents trapped within capitalism need to rationalize our investment in the status quo. And the only way to do that is and the only way sort of like capitalist powers to be sort of keep us that way, keep us like refusing, keep us from revolting, keep us from fundamentally changing the way the world works, is by like circulating metaphors and circulating orientations that depoliticize us, right? That say that your individual refusal is productive. Your withholding of your labor is productive. And this is particularly noxious because it prevents us from organizing in the political manner necessary to fundamentally change things about the world. An example of this that I like is like sometimes KFs that are like about Black women, like will answer a framework by being like, you're demanding labor from like Black women, you're demanding labor from us, we refuse to give you our labor. And then they'll frame that as a reason why they also collapse capitalism, because they're just like, yeah, so we refuse our labor. The real problem with this is that in the modern era, refusing your individual labor, or you refusing to act on your own political agency is what capitalists want, right? Like the vast majority of the capitalist system can be run off of like the backs of people in the third world, robots, like people who have to work, otherwise they'll starve. So if that's the case, then all the capitalist like sort of powers to be want is for you to individually decide that the way you're going to fight capitalism is by just like withholding your political agitation, right? Withholding your quote unquote labor. So that's actually like what pro-capitalism in the modern world looks like. It looks like people individually withdrawing from the system, but with not recognizing that that individual withdrawal is what keeps the system going, because there aren't enough people actively agitating against the system, because they've all decided that individual withdrawal is what they need to solve it. Does that make sense?
So are you saying like it's kind of like a domino effect that capitalism wants you to like stop engaging with politics so they can like keep going on? Okay.
Yeah, totally. It's exactly that, right? Like this idea that being oriented away from politics is what sort of capitalism wants you to do. And thinking that your own individual refusal is radical is also what capitalism wants you to think. Because that's what keeps the gears moving, right? Sure. Someone asks, can I just talk about like the link argument against like state is always bad? So like this was like how you make the state link to apps that are like the state might be not bad. It's about like linking it to their metaphors. If the app is just straight up like the state is bad, then you just like read your classic like politicals changes good cards and like read a defense of that. And I think the defense of that is just like really simple, right? Like it's just like it is the only institution which has the reach to be able to fundamentally transform the world. Like if you can't work outside of the state in a meaningful sense, because like how many people are you going to reach? How many things are you going to affect when the state is the fulcrum and the like vector of like the vast majority of like violence and injustice in the world? Like if poor allocation of capital is what is causing hundreds of millions of people to go hungry, like how are you going to fix that absent reworking and retooling political institutions to be like sort of to work for justice? Like think about it like this, like think about healthcare in America, right? Like death gaps between Black and white Americans are huge. And part of that is just like a poverty that has resulted from years of racial violence and discrimination. And part of that is just like the insurance companies sort of like predatory practices, which result in people going bankrupt and like sort of like losing all of their money and losing all of their livelihood. You can't solve that by rejecting the state. Like you can't solve that by like community organizing. The only thing you can do to affect those things is single payer, right? Like that's the old, like that is what, like, because like being anti-state like basically kind of means you're pro-market. Like like there's no outside to that, right? Like you gotta, if you want to change things about the insurance market, you got to change the way the state works, because that's the only institution able to affect those things. Someone asked me a question about like whether it's birth to read Black Marxism against anti-Blackness affirmatives. Yeah, totally. Like in the vast majority of instances, I always think Black Marxism is better than just like regular CapK. And I think that like in the vast majority of like all of the link arguments I'm making the Black Marxist argument. Like Black Marxists aren't just like it's Black Marxism is not just like putting the word black in front of like Marxism. Like they're like a group of radical thinkers that like genuinely sort of like believe in and have developed like an important like really deep theory of racial capitalism. And like I think in the vast majority of instances, like you should just be reading like more like later Marxists. Like you should be reading like Marxist materialists that sort of acknowledge racial capitalism, because like I do acknowledge that like there are like a bunch of dude bro Marxists out there who are like, oh, you talked about race, like that makes me unhappy because I'm white, but I'm just going to say it makes me unhappy because of class. And there are a lot of Marxists there that are just like, shh, don't talk about race. That's like the dumb type of Marxism that makes no sense. You should be reading the type of Marxism that like sort of like is more sort of oriented against that. Someone asks, how do you answer like AF is a prerequisite to the alt? Because like, you know, that's the only way to transform conditions for Black people, or like, you know, that's the only way to change things. Just like contesting those premises, right? Contesting one, that identity is something that's ontologically formed, i.e. just having the ontology debate. Contesting two, that whether like politics is worth it or not. And contesting three, whether their individual strategy has the ability to fundamentally change conditions of Blackness, right? So basically what I'm saying is that if you win your argument, you're disproving this AF claim that like they are the prerequisite to solving. Independently, and this is a good thing for everyone to note, this argument that the AF is a prerequisite is generally just a good link argument for you. There's a card out there, Bergam, I think in 15, you can like I will at the very end of this lecture I will give you a bunch of rounds to go watch and a bunch of docs to look at and see if you can find articles and stuff. So don't worry about the card for now. But basically it says that when you assign a prerequisite to politics, to the person who's asking me that if I can like list some good Black Marxist authors, yep, totally. At the end I will like give you all of the resources you need to construct your own file. Yeah. So I hope that, yeah, helps. So when you assign a prerequisite to politics, i.e. you say, my individual liberation is a prerequisite to engaging in political action broadly, this results in an infinite deferral of politics, because the world will never be perfect enough for us to like engage in politics without getting our hands dirty, right? So if the AF sets the bar of engaging in politics at like fix anti-Blackness first, like I don't think we'd be doing politics for like 10,000 years. And if your thesis is correct that you can't fix anti-Blackness without first, like, you know, doing politics, then the AF has gotten gotten it totally backwards, right? So like if your arg is just like, if the AF's arg is just like, I need to engage in self-care before you're allowed to do politics, like that is the link, right? Like that is what's the problem with modern identity politics people. It's that they're not interested in like genuine transformation, right? They're not interested in genuine political agitation. They say that their stuff is a prerequisite to doing that, but the problem is that they never get around to doing it in the first place, because they've set up like just this like they basically set it up so that like it never happens. It's infinitely deferred. Okay, third thing, strategies of organizing. Marxist materialist thinks that you should think that you should have what's called vertical organization as opposed to horizontal organization. So horizontal organization is like super fluid. It's a movement that's like not like doesn't do too much gatekeeping, isn't like organized in terms of like a leadership or a hierarchy. And sometimes affirmatives would be like, rules are always oppressive, like don't tell me what to do, like, let me do me, like our self-care strategy is you do you. Marxists are like, no, there's a right and a wrong answer when it comes to how to engage the world, right? Like some strategies are bad, some strategies are good. So if the AF has like a really libertarian take on how to be progressive, like that's not progressive at all, right? Because there are some things that are genuinely progressive and there are some things that are not progressive. And so when the AF is just like, let people like our AF is you do you, like that's a bad frame for politics, because it doesn't let anyone criticize you for doing you, and it doesn't let anyone say that like you should like criticize you for doing politics badly. So I think that sort of like, it's important to have vertical and like organized, like strong political movements is really important. And like some other areas in which I see this applying are like when KAPs like sometimes engage in authenticity testing, where they're like, if you're like not black, like you just have to surrender to blackness, or like if you're not black, like default to black people, or like if you're a male, like default to women, like that type of thing. There are great Marxist critiques of this. Like there's an article out there, I think, called like, if I have it, it's like your skin folk ain't your kinfolk. This article is phenomenal. And it's about like a sort of like, oh yeah, totally. Like this is the classic example of this, which is just like Candace Owens is like awful. Like Candace Owens is one of the most genuinely like anti-black, like horrible for everyone people out there. But like given that leftist liberal identity politics have set up like listen to black women for like years now, she's just like, oh my God, like, are you criticizing a black woman for like saying her opinion? Like, how dare, like, you're the racist because you're criticizing a black woman for being Republican. And then the Marxists are out there like, no, we're criticizing you for being a fascist, like not criticizing you for being a, so I think that's like the classic example of this, right? Which is that to liberals, Candace Owens plays the like, hey, like, how come you're criticizing black women for their political opinions? Like, that's pretty racist of you. And that's the card that Candace Owens plays every time. But like, that's wrong, right? Because Candace Owens is a proto-fascist who like kind of deserves to burn in hell for all the things she says. And she's like actively harmful to the black community. She perpetuates the worst myths about them. There's like her constant thing, like after every time like someone is killed by the police, it's just like, man, if only their father was around. Like it's nuts, like the level of like pathology that she perpetuates and feeds into like conservative psyches. But every time a liberal criticizes her, she's just like, oh, so like now you don't want to let black people have their political opinions? Like that's like this is the problem with sort of like race as the basis for authenticity, or race as the basis of being progressive enough, right? Like if someone is just like default black, like you can't contest what my app says, like you don't have the right to, like you don't have the place to, that is a dangerous setup in terms of political organizing, because it makes like just being a certain race like a check mark in terms of whether you're progressive enough, and that's like wild, right? And like, just like deeply unstrategic politically. Okay, fourth thing. I think that like a little bit more on this like political organizing stuff. There's also like like, is everyone familiar with like the Twitter leftist like style of like sort of activism, where like people are canceled, or like people like sort of engage in like sort of woke circles? Yeah. So this dude named Mark Fisher has a phenomenal critique of this. I think it's called Exiting the Vampire's Castle, where he basically just like roasts the crap out of Twitter leftists, because he basically says that leftists right now have no political power, and we don't want to do the work to get political power. So what do? We create circles of just like ourselves, where we can be proud moral winners. Like we can be like, oh yes, like I didn't vote, like I refused the system today, and get applauded for that, and then be like constant political losers because like conservative proto-fascists get elected all the time, or like policies get passed that just like genuinely like just deport like mass amounts of immigrants, right? So, and then the other things that like the sort of people within these like leftist Twitter circles do is that they tell anyone who criticizes them for not being material enough that they're being racist or that they're being sexist, right? The classic examples of this is just like every time like white feminists were like, Bernie Sanders is a sexist, which was wild, by the way, because like Bernie Sanders is backed by some of the like most progressive women on the planet, and Hillary Clinton's entire staff was made up of a bunch of like fascists who like, you know, killed a bunch of Iraqis and other people in the Middle East. You know, like, but to like white women in America, like it was like, oh no, like a Bernie bro was angry at me online, so I'm going to use this as my primary argument for why people don't deserve healthcare, which is like wild. And so like this has the whole point is that this attitude towards politics, this sort of like performative wokeness, has a tangible political effect because it creates what Fisher calls an economy of guilt, where white people basically get to take the easy way out by saying that like by doing the right thing and just sort of ceding to like an ontological account of race by surrendering to blackness or whatever, right? And it just sort of endlessly defers the responsibility of creating a less racist and a less classist world. And the example that I like best for this is just like the way feminists reamed Bernie Sanders. Because to be clear, Bernie Sanders was like definitely had the like least sexist in terms of positive change for gender identity and gender like equality. Bernie has had the best platform out of everybody, right? And so like the Clinton Bernie like sort of political divide in 2016 is a good example of the Vampire's Castle sort of like thing, which I think is important to remember. Okay. In the interest of time, well, I'll go over the fourth one, and then I guess I'm not just going to skip the like fifth one. The fourth area in which I think Marxists disagree is the power of humanism. So a lot of like sort of like critical race theorists will dismiss humanism, and I think humanism's pretty good, and I think you should say it's good whenever you're reading this, Kay. And I think it's like independent offense too. But before I get into why, can someone tell me what they think humanism is?
Just
Centering values around like protecting humans, so like human rights, stuff like that.
Yeah, and like by emphasizing the oneness of the human race, by saying that like humans are all equal, like everybody's life matters. Now the criticism you get from this is that it sounds like all lives matter, and it sounds like like that like weird elementary school stuff where they were like, there is no black race, there's no white race, there's only the human race, like that nonsense. Yeah, so that's the opposite of what radical humanists think. Radical humanists think that all lives matter is the end goal. Like they think that like the fundamental principle is that everyone is worth something, that everyone as a human deserves the right to life, deserves the right to like food, housing, fundamental human rights. But they're not like, the way all lives matter gets deployed in the status quo is to downplay the importance of Black Lives Matter or downplay the importance of structural problems in the society. Radical humanists say that this is correct in the sense that like, it is because we think that all lives are worth something that we are cognizant of the massive structural disparity in the status quo of whose life matters, right? Like in the status quo, like there are like large scale structural disparities in terms of everyone matters. And the quote that like really resonates with me here is, whoops, got it backwards. No one is free until everybody's free. And I think this is Fannie Lou Hamer. And I think that this is a good example of like what the ideology of humanism is, right? Which is that it's a fundamental faith and a pursuit of this sort of axiomatic commitment to equality, the sort of importance of genuine like sort of transformation and active affirmation of everyone's human rights. And the reason this concept is important is because it's how you make stuff happen, right? It's how you convince people that like other people are worth agitating for. And this gets sums up in like, I think one of the most profound sort of like political statements a modern like mainstream candidate has ever made, which is, does anyone know what like one of the like more famous Bernie slogans was before he dropped out of the race?
It's not me, it's us, or something like that.
Yeah, and there was one more that I think of that I just like loved, and I was shocked that like, it was not feel the burn. I think it was quote, "I will fight for someone I don't know," and it's that ideal which I think is just like sort of brilliant, right? And it sort of forms the basis of a truly progressive, truly egalitarian politics. So when you look at structural disparities in the status quo and go and sort of turn inwards, right? You sort of turn inwards to your identity group, as opposed to using it as a motivation to turn outwards and say, we need a truly progressive egalitarian world for everybody, that no one is free until everybody is free. It's that sort of critique that the radical humanists think is important, and think is like very, very good. And that's like the basis of this argument, right? Which is that it's important to think that everyone is worth something, because that's the political motivation that we have to create a truly progressive status quo. That is, it's what convinces people to do that. It's what convinces people to fight for someone they don't know. Okay. Now I'm going to get a little less like preachy and a little more just like into the debate stuff, like the like tricks and tips and tricks I have when you're reading the CapK. One, read a TVA on T that's like state action, or read the TVA as a counterplane. So either one of two things will happen. Either the AF will permit, and the AF will say this is not mutually exclusive with our AF, in which instance you should go for T, and you're like, they have conceded that the AF is not mutually exclusive with the topic. That was the 1AR. Or they will not permit and be like, the TVA is bad because it affirms state action, that's violent. And then you concede that and go for that as a link to the K. Does that make sense to people?
Can you restate the second one?
Yeah. So either the AF will say that it's not mutually exclusive, in which they've conceded that the topic is not mutually exclusive with their AF, so you should go for T. Or they will read a disad to the TVA, right? They'll say it's bad, like movements fail, politics is bad, politics is violent. And then this is how you get the AF to link to your anti-political K, right? Like your cap K says that they perpetuate anti-political metaphors, that they're fundamentally depoliticizing. And the KF will like try to spin out of that. Like the identity debater will be like, no, we don't preclude it. Like, no, we don't. But if they say this against the TVA, you should point it out as an example of your link argument, right? Because your link argument is that they are anti-political and depoliticizing. And they've proven that by saying against the TVA. And you should read a card that's like, this would just like drastically improve the lives of marginalized people. And if they're like, this is bad because it's like statist or whatever, that is how you called it the domino effect. That is how the domino effect occurs, right? Like maybe the 1AC wasn't anti-political, but when it came to answering the TVA, like boom, they became anti-political, right? So that's how you get a link. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Other things that I think are strategic, external impact, which is just like capitalism causes extinction. There's like a whole lot of disparity across the world in terms of hunger, poverty, wage slavery, like those type of things. The AF can't solve them, only the alt can, which means if the AF precludes the alt, solving all of those things is an opportunity cost to the AF. So you have an external impact to it. Yeah.
Again.
Sorry, what's up?
Could you say that again?
Yeah. It's just like, if you win that the alt solves like capitalism broadly, like in terms of like wage slavery in the third world, or like extinction from ecological destruction, all of that stuff, and you win simultaneously that the AF is mutually exclusive with the alt, then solving all of those things, i.e. net benefits to the alt, become opportunity costs to doing the AF, right? because the AF and the alt are mutually exclusive.
Oh, okay. So like the time that we invest in doing the F is time that we are not investing in solving her wage slavery, which is bad.
Yeah, or it's just like if we win that the alt solves for mass exploitation writ large, and the AF and the alt are mutually exclusive, which you should win on the perm, then there's an opportunity cost to doing the AF, which is that we're not doing the alt. Okay. Other things, I think root cause is important. And the only way you'll ever get good at this is just like reading and cutting cards and like being up and up on like the history of the intersection of Marxism and the AF's theory. But this is important to win because then you can win that the alt solves substantial portions of the case because it decreases like the material manifestations of racism. It like sort of like makes sure that like you can sort of solve the issues the affirmative is pointing out. The last thing I'll say before I just like get into like a deep dive of like authors you should read and videos you should watch and cards you should look at, is that the AF like is how you frame your link arguments, which is like you should say that the affirmative has an elevated responsibility for links, i.e. the links don't literally have to be to the AF advocacy. They can be to the AF scholarship. They can be to the AF's metaphors, because when they've presented a critical affirmative, they've presented a project and a body of scholarship, right? So we should be able to criticize how that body of scholarship like impacts other things. We should be able to criticize the impact of parts of that scholarship. We should be able to criticize the implications of parts of their scholarship. And you can basically view the alt as just a pick out of like whatever you're criticizing, right? So against an anti-blackness affirmative that's like blackness is ontological, we should perform self-care. Like I can just pick out of the ontology part basically, which is what I'm doing when I'm criticizing the AF's ontological underpinnings, which is I'm not disagreeing with like the self-care thing, but you can also disagree with self-care, like you make link arguments to it. But like you're basically just picking out of like the ontological frame that they forwarded. Which is a good way to frame the alt and understand how the alt isn't like a race neutral colorblind project, but it's like actually like a genuine radical like form of transformation. Great. So I'm just gonna spend the last bit of this answering questions and giving y'all rounds to look at to like talk about some of the stuff. Can someone tell me in just like a few words what the first link argument I talked about was?
Are the link arguments like the disagreements between CAP and identity apps that we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. The first one was the conception of identity. So ontological versus from the perspective of historical materialism.
Yep. So the round you should watch here is, that's not how you spell. It's Harvard MS versus Kansas KR. Not the NDT round. This is the Wake Forest semis. I think it's 2018. Phenomenal round for like the ontology is bad, okay, like that type of thing. What was someone else tell me the second link argument I discussed?
That being anti-politics preclude the possibility for change.
Yep. The round for this, I think you should watch Harvard MS versus Kansas KR. This is the NDT semis. What was the third one? Someone else?
We should have a vertical strategy for organizing based around like a coherent organized movement instead of like horizontal fluid movement.
Yep, and that I think you should watch. I think one of the best Cap 2NCs I've ever seen. Rutgers AH reads like a music party type app against Wake HV. I think it's HV. I might get it wrong, but it's the NDT doubles. I think in 2018. It might be 19. Not sure. One of these two. You should watch this 2NC if you don't watch anything else. It's very, very good. Okay, what was the last one?
The humanism link, like Marxists advocate for radical humanism.
Yep, you should watch Michigan HL versus Dartmouth ET. Wake doubles 2019. You should watch the 1&R. Yeah. And then here's one more round that I like keep it to yourselves because like it's an unlisted thing, so like don't post it anywhere. But here's a great round between Harvard and Baylor, between Afro-pessimism and Black Marxism. Okay, great. So those are some rounds. So I've given you one round per each type of link that I isolated, and this is college debate. So yeah, pretty sure you can find these docs like everywhere. So like take a screenshot of this if you want to. I'm going to give you a couple minutes. Let me know if people are ready for me to move on and give some like reading recommendations. Okay, I'm going to speak now if you need me to stop, or if you want me to stop erasing some of this. Okay, great. Author's time. So pretty short comparative, compared to other academic stuff, pretty easy read. It's like 100 pages. Assad Haiders. That's not how you spell that. Mistaken Identity. It's a book. It's very good. Race and Class in the Age of Trump. Okay, great book, pretty short read. I think you can knock it out before school starts. Like it's like pretty good. I'm a huge fan of it. Like it's just a very good book. It's a good at laying out the sort of basic arguments against identity politics. Some more specific stuff for like Black Marxism. So racial capitalism is this idea that sort of provides the basic frame for this by this guy named Cedric Robinson. So you should Google and just like read. You don't have to read stuff that he wrote, but you can like, read about him. But if you're really, really looking for a deep dive into this, he wrote a book called The Making of, he wrote the book on Black Marxism. It's called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. So if you're ever curious, it's like pretty long, so you don't have to read it all, but like it's very good. This is like if you think Black Marxism, like this is like the guy. If you're looking for, you should know about him. You can read some of his stuff. Places to go from here. Cedric Johnson wrote this article. I think it's like something around the lines of like the Panthers can't save us now. And then he's written like a bunch of iterations of this. And it's very, very good at explaining like root cause between sort of like Blackness as a frame and like Marxism and like class struggle. And explaining the differences between racial capitalism and like a more like ontological version of identity. So this is great. You should read everything Cedric Johnson writes. He writes like pretty short stuff. Sometimes he writes a bit of like longer stuff. Oh, awesome. Thanks, Claire. That's great. Great for everyone to know. Thank you so much. Other stuff I think is good. Robin Kelly again, you don't need to read the whole thing, but he has this book on Black communism in Alabama that's just like brilliant history that I think that like if you're just like a history fan, you'll like love this stuff. Now, the last thing I'll say, and this is like comes with like a little warning, Adolf Reed writes like phenomenal link cards between like Black identity politics and Marxism. The problem is that like Reed is just like a straight up orthodox Marxist. Like he's like way through orthodox, like on the like people that talk about race or being obfuscatory like side of things. That like it's like a little rough because like he's like you'll actually link to like the "you're being colorblind" critiques like if you read a little Reed. But like it's worth reading through his stuff to just like, because the articles are like very fun to read, like they're very well written and entertaining and like kind of savage, and like they're great for getting link cards. But I would be wary of like just like the fact that he's like a pretty orthodox Marxist, and if you want to go on the like more like racial capitalism side of things, like you should be aware of that distinction. But like this is a good starting point. If you were going to read a book out of all of these, like the Mistaken Identity book is just like a good primer on just like identity politics history in America. So you'll gain like a basic idea of like what a lot of people are talking about when they go through the history. And then like Claire's points out correctly that if you're interested in Black Marxism, the intro of Robinson's book is great. And then Cedric Johnson writes like good articles like from in that vein. Okay, that's I think time. I want to thank everyone for coming. I had a fun time. This is like one of my favorite arguments to think about. Like I'm not like an expert or anything, but like it's just like it's like a really fun just like piece of history. So I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it entertaining and fun. And I hope you have a good day.